Yes, racial profiling is an acceptable strategy by Whale, Madeline, Tyler, Diana, and Mandy.
First and foremost, while we are for racial profiling, we are not promoting racism. The beginning of the chapter stated this, so we thought it was important to also start with this. We are strictly looking at the data of the crimes and why it is acceptable to racially profile. We can't begin to come up with a solution until we know the problem at hand. That's what we want to do, is introduce you to the problem. Data shows that blacks commit violent crimes 4 to 8 times more than the white rate. Hispanics are 3 times the white rate. Men are more violent than women. Just like police stop and question men more than women, they should also stop blacks more than whites. We are now at a new point with contemporary crime when dealing with race and ethnicity. First, there is a long history of academic attention to differences among racial and ethnic groups' involvement in different sorts of crime. Second, media and political pressure to avoid acknowledgement of the differences and possible consequences of the difference. In New Jersey, Police Superintendent Carl Williams was fired for saying that same minority groups were more likely to be involved in certain crimes. In the same article, he stated he did not condone racial profiling, but at the same time, it is naive to think race is not an issue in some sorts of crime. There are inconsistencies between media reports and crime data that we have regarding race. Now we're going to take a look at some statistics. Black Americans commit 90% of the 1.7 million interracial crimes that occur in the U.S. each year. They're 50 times more likely to commit violent crimes against whites than whites are against blacks. Orientals has always had the lowest serious victim crime rates. So the order is blacks, whites, and then Orientals. Blacks are 1/8 of the population and half of the arrests for murders, rapes, and robberies. A fourth to 1/3 for burglary, larceny, auto theft, and aggravated assault. And the graph at the bottom shows that, but it is a little outdated since it was in 2003.
There are multiple sources from which we are able to get accurate crime statistics. The first source is the National Crime Victimization Survey, or NCVS for short. Every year, the NCVS reports on the frequency of specific crimes, typically sampling upwards of 80,000 individuals from 50,000 households. This source is unique in that it is reported by Americans and not law enforcement, so it remains unfiltered. Another source of data comes from the hate crime statistics. This method does not require law enforcement to report to the FBI, even though most already do. In 1997, 11,211 hate crimes were reported by local agencies. Published annually, the Uniform Crime Reports are the standard reference for crime rates in the U.S. In the UCR, the FBI included reports from 17,000 law enforcement. This is the most comprehensive and authoritative report we have. If we look back to the 1994 NCVS, we can look at and compare interracial crime. 6,830,360 whites reported being victims of violent crimes. Just over 1 million of those victims reported their perpetrator being black. On the other hand, 1,100,490 blacks reported being victims of violent crime, with over 130,000 reporting having a white perpetrator. So what does that look like in terms of rate? To find the rate, we need to divide crimes of a given population by that population, then multiply that by 100,000, which represents a sample population. So for whites, the crime rate would be 135,360 crimes divided by 6,830,360 in a white population. Times that by 100,000, this gives us a crime rate of 62.5 interracial crimes per 100,000 whites. For blacks, we divide 1,140,670 by a population of 32,653,000. Times that by a population of 100,000, we get a rate of 3,493.3 crimes per 100,000 blacks. So yes, blacks do target whites much more frequently than whites target blacks. Another factor to consider is that homicides are not included because victims cannot be interviewed. Why is there such a large gap in crime rates? The idea is that whites are a bigger target because they are more likely to be wealthy.
Race, crime, and SES. Race plays a large factor in crime and socioeconomic status. It is a major contributing factor to the prediction of crime. According to the APA, SES affects overall human functioning, including our physical and mental health. Low SES also affects education levels, which have a large impact on the predictors of who will commit crimes. The SES of each race is visible in the poverty levels for each group, with 9.9% non-Hispanic whites, 26.6% of Hispanics, and 27.4% of African Americans living in poverty. Race, crime, and populations. According to the 2016 U.S. Census Bureau, non-Hispanic whites made up 76.9% of the U.S. population, African Americans made up 13.3%, and Hispanics made up 17.8%. Following these population numbers, out of every 100,000 juveniles in detention, correctional, or residential facilities, 433 are African Americans, 86 are non-Hispanic whites, and 142 are Hispanics. This information clearly shows that not only are there a larger number of African American and Hispanics in the judicial system in proportion to their total population, there is also a positive correlation that the differences in SES between races has an effect on who is more likely to commit crimes.
Hispanic crime rate. The UCR Uniform Crime Report doesn't separate Hispanics into their own category, so nearly all of Hispanics that are arrested in the U.S. go into official records as white. This may distort the results of crime in the white category. The California Department of Justice does separate Hispanics from non-Hispanic whites, and their arrest rates show that Hispanics, as with blacks, are arrested at considerably higher rates than whites. Some governments also consider Hispanics as their own category, and the Department of Justice has found that the incarceration rate per 100,000 for Hispanics is 688, non-Hispanic blacks is 1,571, and non-Hispanic whites is 193. Therefore, Hispanics are roughly 3 times more likely than non-Hispanic whites to be arrested for various crimes. By using this information, we can determine that the rate for non-Hispanic whites decreases by 19.5% if Hispanics are separated into their own category. As you can see, racial profiling is not only targeted towards African Americans, but other races as well to help us determine sources of crime. Men vs. women, black vs. whites. Although many resist the idea of racial differences in crime, there are other group differences that people observe. For example, men in their late teens and 20s are much more prone to violence than men beyond their 50s, showing differences in age and crime. There is an understanding that younger generations are more violent than older generations. Another example, men have higher arrest rates than women, showing differences in sex and crime. There is an understanding that men are more violent or dangerous than women. Just how men are more likely to be arrested than women, blacks are more likely than whites to be arrested. Asians are arrested at lower rates than whites, which shows that there are other differences in race and crime other than just whites versus blacks. Racial profiling is then just acceptable as age profiling or sex profiling because it targets those who are statistically more prone to crime and doesn't waste police efforts in catching criminals.
The other side of the argument, racial profiling is inconsistent and it only takes you so far in finding a person. And what I mean by that is, you could like just stereotype like African American man and be like, he's 6'4", very built, muscular, and you see another guy like that, and you could take his life or stereotype something and call something that's probably not the same guy. The biggest thing with racial profiling is that it's a conflict with police and discretion and other things as well, like discrimination, racism, and stereotyping. Examples, incarceration are not representative of the crime, and they don't really represent the violent crime. They only represent the violent crime. They don't really, Black African American people who get racially profiled, mainly they do violent crimes. They don't really do like white collar crimes, and the white people that do white collar crimes like eventually pay the money and they don't do any serving. Racial profiling is a patently illegal, violating the U.S. Constitutional promise of equal protection of the law and the freedom of the unreasonable searches and seizures. Racial profiling is illegal, and I don't think I need to say anything else with that. Conclusion. Racial profiling is found to be a simplistic strategy that doesn't consist of race but other characteristics to future the search. However, the dilemma it creates outweighs its convenience. Racial profiling is a product for countless lawsuits and the belief of social injustice. It also is constitutional and invades our rights of society that we create.